Hello everyone. Working memory model today. Quite a, I would say one of the more difficult ones for students to initially get. A few years ago, this was one that absolutely nobody ever understood, and the exams would basically crush them. So I think in the last couple of years, people have really started to wrap their head around working memory model. One thing to note, and this is quite important, it's this what we're looking at today is an extension of the multi-store model. It's not really an opposing theory. It's an extension of the work from multi-store model, but working memory model is exclusively about short-term memory. So everything I'm about to show you today is talking, and such as here, all this is what happens within the short-term memory according to the multi-store model. Now there is a voice note on here, and I recommend you look through or listen to that voice note, but this is basically the working memory model. So what it is basically an inference. This theory is an inference, is an educated guess about how short-term memory works and the processes and mechanisms within short-term memory. One piece of advice for this theory: don't think about this as memory. I know this is the working memory model, but working memory is not so much about what you can remember. It's more about how you are processing information coming in through your senses. And I'll say that again because it's quite important. Working memory model is not so much about what you can remember, right? So in terms of memory, it's not so much about what you can remember. It's about how your short-term memory processes information coming into it. Now, we already know from multi-store model that short-term memory is fragile. It decays very quickly. It's easily distractible. So this theory goes into it. Now, working memory model is a really, really key theory. So I'm going to start off with the very, very basics. I'm going to go through the structure of the working memory model. So you've got the central executive. Now, the central executive is what holds all of your attentional resources. So right now, for example, you have a certain amount of attention, right? And hopefully you're trying to put a lot of that attention onto watching the video and listening to what's happening. Right. Now, the reason why, by the way, you're having to put attention, this is really, really important. The reason why you're having to put loads of attention on it is because it's an unfamiliar task, isn't it? You've maybe never seen this video before, or maybe seen it a couple of times. You don't know it off the top of your head. When I drive in the morning, I've done it so many times that I don't actually have to pay that much attention to what I am doing. I know the route off the top of my head. I know how long the traffic lights are green for, so I don't really need to pay attention to that. The only thing I need to make sure I'm doing is not crashing into somebody, and that doesn't really take that much attention. So the point I'm trying to get at here is that when I'm driving, my central executive doesn't actually have to dole out that much attentional resources to either of these systems because it's a practiced task. If I were to, for example, try to juggle these two, and I'd never really juggled before, I'd have to really, really pay attention to what I am doing, for example, right? I'd have to really, really pay attention to it. But if I did that, so if I trained juggling a brain and a ball, if I trained, it would get to the point where that's such a familiar task to me that I do not have to spend that much attention. It's like if I were to ask you to recite the alphabet. You don't have to spend that much attention on it, so you can afford to spend that attention elsewhere on other things. And that pretty much sums up the task, right? So that pretty much sums up the model. So the central executive is what holds the attentional resources. It has no capacity for information. And again, this is quite important and definitely worth noting down. And its main role is to dole out and delegate attentional resources to the two slave systems, which are the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad, which I'll go through in a bit more detail. The episodic buffer, its main role is to basically get what you have learned from your phonological loop, what you have learned from your Visuospatial Sketchpad and combine them into one memory that then gets put down into your long-term memory. That is the basic role of the episodic buffer. It has a little bit of a capacity, but we'll go through this in a bit more detail. So let's go. That, by the way, is the very basics of the working memory model. But let's go into a bit more detail. So the central executive, as it says here, supervises and coordinates a number of slave systems, in this case, at least two, the phonological loop and the Visuospatial Sketchpad, and it directs your attention to particular tasks. Now, if you are doing a listening task, and you are literally doing a listening task right now, your central executive is going to be sending attention to your phonological loop, right, which is kind of mostly in your ear, but parts in your brain, because it's trying to get you to pay attention to those words that are coming in. The central executive has no storage capacity, so it can't actually hold any information in. All it does, it just throws out attentional resources. Students sometimes don't get what I mean by attentional resources, and so I've tried to explain this already. I'll try to do it in a different way, but attentional resources are essentially, right, you have a certain amount of attention right now, okay? You can't pay like an unbelievable amount of attention to you don't have unlimited attention. So if I were to get you to do one thing that takes your attention, but I get you to do another task that takes your attention, and another task that takes your attention, and another task that takes your attention, you're doing 4 separate tasks that demand your attention. The critical point here is that the more tasks you do, the more your attention is spread out, the less attention you can give, and therefore the worse the performance will be. That's pretty critical, I would say. I'd say it's a pretty critical part of what it is I'm trying to explain. So, every time I'm going to go through one of these, I'm going to then supply a piece of research, and most of them, if I'm going to be honest with you, if not all of them, are done by Alan Baddeley. So I'm going to give you a piece of research, and you do need to know this about central executive. He asked people to generate random strings of digits on a keyboard. Now, this is actually pretty difficult because they have to be random, so you can't accidentally type out a word. So if I were to just type in random, if I've got a keyboard just down here, for example, I have to really pay attention to not accidentally type a word. Right, now, this is not a practice task. You have a sad life. You have a really sad life if you can type on here very quickly, knowing that you're not going to accidentally type a word, right? Because to get to that point where you can practice that much, you've lost many weekends of your life to typing randomly on a keyboard, which is really sad. So a really important thing to note is that these tasks for this working memory model, they kind of rely on giving a really odd task, because odd tasks, describing the angles on the letter F, for example, nobody can do that off the top of their head. Nobody can do that without thinking. Everybody has to direct attention to there, right? So a lot of these, and there's a big criticism of the pieces of research, is a lot of these pieces of research rely on tasks that, quite frankly, do not relate to real life. But anyway, so he got participants to type randomly on a keyboard and avoid some kind of pattern emerging. He then also got them to do alongside that one of 3 tasks. So this is independent groups, right? You've got 3 separate groups doing 3 separate tasks. So he got them typing, and they had to recite the alphabet. Now, easy. Reciting the alphabet doesn't take any of your attention. It does, because it's easy. It's a practiced, familiar task. So I'm just waving this keyboard around. He either got them to do that, or they typed and counted from 1. If you have to spend attention to count to 1, you really should go back to primary school. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. That's easy to do. The third one's not easy to do. You alternating between letters and numbers. This is a far less practiced task than reciting the alphabet or counting from one. And unsurprisingly, the typing of the keyboard became less random in condition 3, where participants had to switch to alphabet and numbers because their attention was being spread too thin. And when your attention is spread too thin, your performance declines, basically. So that is really, really good evidence of the central executive and how it has a limited amount of attentional resources. Fine. There we go. So there are some criticisms of the, and here's the thing, AQA, and this is a really important point, AQA may either get you to evaluate the central executive as a whole, or they may get you to evaluate parts of the central executive. In 2022, they started asking people to evaluate the central executive or the phonological loop instead of the theory or model as a whole. So you need to understand that the central executive is really vague and difficult to test. You can't see it. You can't observe it. It's not empirical, for example. And the golden rule of science is it's very, very difficult to measure something that you cannot see, and you can't see the central executive. It is, however, backed up by research, and we've just gone through that. It is worth noting that actually maybe the central executive is actually made up of smaller components, but we haven't yet kind of understood them fully and split them open and subcategorized them. So that's an important point. A bit vague because there's no evidence for that, but also there's massive practical applications. Let me ask you this. Do you really think that everybody has the same amount of attentional resources available to them? Boys and girls, I'd say girls probably have more. The time of day. So the time of day you do something, your attention varies, right? So a good thing about this is that it does actually kind of help us explain attentional deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Maybe people with ADHD just have naturally lower levels of attention, and maybe that's why they are deficit in their attentional abilities. So anyway, let's move on to the next one. Now, this is the first slave system, the phonological loop, and this is all. Phon is sound, right? So this is all to do, hence the reason mobile phone, you use it to hear sound. The phonological loop is all to do with the processing of auditory information. And it's split a little bit further down. I actually quite like this here explains the phonological store and the phonological loop, because it is split further down. So as I said, again, you are currently right now using, hopefully, your phonological loop to listen to the words I am saying and to put them in the same order. A big part of the phonological loop is it preserves the order of information. Just imagine how difficult it would be to pay attention to someone talking to you if your ear jumbled up the order of the words. How difficult that would be to understand. So the phonological loop is consisted on two parts. The phonological store, and it's a store, right? You in a store, you hold things in a store, right? And so the reason why I'm getting maybe a bit animated at this is because students aren't particularly good at going past the phonological loop. They're just like, it's about sound, isn't it? Right? And no, there's a lot more to it than that. That was a perfect impression of a student, I feel. So the phonological store holds the words you hear like an inner ear. So it goes in, and the store just holds it there for maybe a couple of seconds. There's a story I'll tell my students about when I was leaning back on my chair in secondary school, which I always used to do. I was a right little shit back in school. And Mrs. Humphrey screamed at me out of nowhere, because she would always get really annoyed. And I was an RS, and she screamed at me out of nowhere, "Kieran, what was I saying?" And I was absolutely not paying attention, right? I was not paying attention. I was looking outside at the grass because it was a really sunny day and I wanted to go play football. But because my phonological store was still taking in information, I may not have been paying attention to it, but it was still taking in information. It held it in my head for a couple of seconds, what she was saying. And so I was able to turn around and be like, "Oh, miss, you're talking about Buddhists." And then she was like, "Oh." oh, it looked like you weren't paying attention. And in my head, I was like, I wasn't. So the phonological store holds information for a very short period of time before it starts to decay. On the other hand, the articulatory process, and you can kind of see its point just here, is used to rehearse verbal information from the phonological store. So if you hear something, your store holds it. The articulatory process can then repeat it to kind of refresh it almost, right? That's the key point, is to hold it in your head. If I were to say to you 54724661, if the store holds it, you can play, and then you can play my voice 4362461. I think that was wrong, but you can hear it in your head, can't you? And that's the articulatory process going round and almost refreshing it, or almost rehearsing it almost. I mean, it literally does say rehearse there. And that is the point. So memory traces in the auditory store decay in 1 or 2 seconds, but you can maintain it in your head by repeating it, by articulating it to yourself. So you need some research. So Baddeley gave some word lists. So some, harm, bear, love, snack. Those are short words. Thus, they do not take up that much room in your head. On the other hand, you have these words. Organization. 1, 2, 3, 4. University. Is that a 5-syllable word? University? It doesn't feel like it should be. Association, neurological, undeniable. Now, these are longer words, hence they take up more space in your phonological loop, and therefore you're not going to remember as many of the long words, despite the fact they are each one word. So participants are given short lists and long lists, and they recalled more short words than long words. The reason is you can fit more of these words in 2 seconds than you can in here. So that is good evidence about it. I'm not going to go into articulatory suppression, but this is a little technique that Baddeley would do by getting them to say things like la, 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 la. Saying the la, 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 la suppresses your ability to keep articulating it in your head. You looked at this a little bit with Peterson and Peterson when they would get you to count backwards in numbers to prevent you from being able to rehearse. La 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 la. I can't rehearse things in my head when I'm going la 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 la. So yeah, good point. Evaluations, again, I'm not going to go through it because they're quite similar. Yes, there are practical applications. Yes, there's research. Sorry, I just burped. I come out nowhere. Yes, there's research support, and yes, it's also a very, very difficult thing to be able to. It's an incredibly difficult thing to be able to test because you cannot see the phonological loop. Not quite finally, but in terms of the slave systems, this is the second and final slave system. The visuospatial sketchpad deals with not auditory information like the phonological loop. It deals with visual and spatial information. What we mean by this is really good at mapping out your environment, your physical environment around you. So I use the phonological loop when I drive. I'm mapping out where cars are going. I'm paying attention to it, although not that much. And when you're walking anywhere, to prevent you from walking into things, you obviously have to pay attention. If you're in your room right now, maybe, I don't know, whatever room you're in, and you want to go get some food, right, and you have to map your way to the kitchen. Some of you may do your work in the kitchen. Fair play, rebels, mavericks. You can't just close your eyes and guess like your route. You have to pay attention to where you are walking. And when you are paying attention to where you are walking, you're using the phonological loop. So visual information refers to what things look like. Spatial information refers to the layout of things relative to each other. So you use spatial quite a lot when you're driving. So that is... There's not a lot to the VSS. There is more to the VSS, don't get me wrong, and I definitely recommend looking at it, but that's all I'm going to go through here. Baddeley and Cole in 1993. I really like this piece of research. Okay, so I just want to go back here actually, because I want to ask you something. What we don't know, what's harder? If I give you 2 tasks from the same slave system, So if I get you to listen to two different conversations in the room and pay equal amount of good attention to both, is that hard? Or is that harder? Or is it harder if I get you to do one phonological loop task and one visuospatial task? What would be harder? Baddeley and Gathercole in 1993 found this out. So what they did is they demonstrated the existence of the visuospatial sketchpad, and they basically had a pointer, right? They had a this isn't one. What the hell? Okay, but they had like a laser pen basically, and they moved it around the room, and you had to pay attention to that. Now that is a what? Sorry. That's ridiculous. That is a clearly that is a novel task. You have to pay attention to that. If I'm making you look trace it like a laser pen red dot, that is not a practice task because you have no idea where the person's about to go, so you have to constantly pay attention. Fine, they got them to do that. They would track a light around the room, and they again got them to do one or two tasks. They would either get them to describe all the angles on the letter F, like I said earlier, or they got them to track the laser pen and perform a verbal task at the same time. Now, the laser pen is a visual spatial task. You need to understand that. The laser pen is a visual task because it's you're dealing with information. You're paying attention to information in your environment. You're not listening to it, are you? It's not a phonological loop. This one here is also a visual task because you're having to picture an F in your head. That's a visual task. You're having to picture an F in your head and then work out what the angles on the letter F are, right? So you're going up and then, all right, you go up, you go up, and then you have a 270 degree angle, for example, and then you go to the right, then you have a 360 degree angle, then you go in left. So that's actually quite difficult. You have to hold it in your head. And what Baddeley found was participants found task 1 very difficult, but not task 2. Mainly because task 1 involves 2 visual spatial tasks, and that's actually harder than if we have one visual, one phonological loop. So going back to that thing that I said earlier, what's harder? I challenge you to go into the canteen when you're next to college, and if next time your friend is talking to you, I want you to continue staring at them, continue paying attention to them, but pay attention to another conversation. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible to do, right? Whereas if you are, listening to them, but you're also writing down some homework, that's a visual task, by the way, that's a lot easier to do. So basically, it's much easier when we have one task here, rather than 2 tasks hitting the same slave system. Again, that's quite important. That is quite important because it does tell us quite a lot. What should teachers not do? Teachers should not talk whilst their students are writing and then get them to do another task, because they're not going to be able to pay attention to all of them. There is a bit more evidence here as well, which I'm not going to go through. This is further evidence of the visuospatial sketchpad. But to be honest, I would know Baddeley. I would also know Brooks 1968 as well. This is a good piece of research, and it really, really does quite well to show the VSS, the visual spatial sketchpad as well. So I would recommend knowing both, definitely. And finally, the episodic buffer. Now, importantly, for about 20 years, the episodic buffer was not part of the model. Baddeley added the model in 2000. The reason why this is quite crucial to know, quite vital to know, is it shows this theory has what we call scientific adaptability. The theory will adapt to overwhelming evidence and can be updated. So it kind of admits that it's wrong. That's quite impressive, by the way, the fact that the theory can be adapted, because science is constantly evolving, is constantly adapting. If the theories are not, then that's not a scientific thing. So Baddeley went away and thought, you know what? There's nothing. What he went away with, everything we looked at so far holds no capacity. It doesn't hold the memories somewhere. But we know from multi-store model that short-term memory can hold 5 to 9 things. So Baddeley went away and addressed this criticism, and he included what's called the episodic buffer. It has a limited amount of capacity, 5 to 9 items, 18 to 30 seconds maybe. But what it does is it basically, as I said earlier, it integrates information from all the slave systems into one memory. I'll say that again because this is pretty much the main role of the episodic buffer. It takes information from the phonological loop, it takes information from the visuospatial sketchpad, and it combines it into one memory before moving it on to long-term memory. And that is pretty much a role. If you want to go proper posh with it, it combines them into a unitary multi-dimensional representation of a memory. Nailed it. And it says down here, the episodic buffer is designed to fill a gap in the model because none of the 3 components we looked at so far can be regarded as general storage, which is pretty much we know is in a short-term memory. There is evidence here. I'm not going to go through that. You can pause the video and read it yourself, but I would definitely recommend doing that. And that's also quite biological evidence as well. In terms of evaluations, as I say, it has scientific adaptability, but once again, it's impossible to fully observe. It's not empirical, right? We cannot see the episodic buffer, not yet anyway. That's pretty much it in terms of AO1. In terms of AO3, I've got some short fire, some short points here. So I'm getting distracted. I'm not in my office. I'm getting distracted by everything in Anthony's office. But I've got some short ones here. The working memory model shows memory as active, not passive, like the multi-store model. So what we mean by this is the working memory model accepts that we process information actively. It's not like information goes in and we don't do anything. It just takes this course. We know that memory is an active processor, that we're using this information all the time. So you could argue this is a better theory than multi-store model. As I said, it shows scientific adaptability because of the inclusion of the episodic buffer in the year 2000. But also, this research created tasks that can be used in highlighting how memory works differently. That's a very, very vague point. It's also backed up by research. So I'd use that one. I'd use point 1, 2, and 4 there, definitely. In terms of weaknesses, like I say, it's generally untestable. Inferences, or also known as educated guesses based on research, must be made. But also an extent to that is it could be argued that this theory is mechanically reductionist. The reason why it's mechanically reductionist, and we do need to understand reductionism, maybe not now, because if you're year 1, it's quite early in the game. If you're year 2, you definitely should know mechanical reductionism. But mechanical reductionism is when you reduce a complex behavior like memory down to a model that tries to explain it. That's not good. Not good. Reductionism is a mostly bad thing, though there are good points to it. And lastly, it does tend to rely on, I'd say, lab studies, but also unfamiliar, unrealistic tasks that lack ecological validity. In terms of strengths and weaknesses, I do have a model peel here. I'm hoping at this point, if you're year 1, but again, definitely if you're year 2, you're starting to understand how to structure peels a little bit, right? You have a point just here that you're writing fine. You then have to back it up as evidence. So at that point, I've just said, actually, an issue with the working memory model is that the research tends to use artificial tasks in order to see the working memory model effect. That's a point. I haven't said evidence. I haven't said why this is important. I haven't elaborated, haven't linked back. A point is short and sharp and to the point. A point is usually 1 sentence. I then need to give evidence. For example, Baddeley's task of describing the angles on the letter F is not real to life and lacks ecological validity. Always look to pack your evidence and your point with terms. Much research needs to utilize unrealistic and unfamiliar tasks such as this to elicit an observable response from the central executive. Now, when it comes to elaboration, students find elaboration the hardest. Elaboration is basically why your point is important. Why is it important that Baddeley uses artificial tasks? Well, as it says here, this use of unfamiliar tasks ensures the theory does not have great external validity, cannot be applied to real life, and does not reflect everyday tasks. And as a result, this theory is less useful. This is where you pack your evaluative terminologies. You then need to link back, and this is crucial, by the way. I always start my link back to a therefore. Therefore, the theory cannot fully explain real-life scenarios as much of the research is not realistic. I have another point here as well, but this is a strength on this case about talking about scientific adaptability. If you want to pause this and go through it, read it, understand it, get the evidence, understand the elaboration, that's it. But that is everything for this bullet point. A couple of tough questions have come up on this quite recently, mainly 16 markers, because AQA know this is not the sexiest part of the spec, and it's quite dry. People find this quite a bit technical, but make sure you know it all. Hope that was useful. Peace out.